Y'all, this isn't just another celebrity rumor. This is the kind of leak that destroys timelines, exposes secrets, and leaves reputations in flames overnight. Because what you're about to hear allegedly didn't just end relationship, it shattered an entire narrative that millions of fans believed was real. It all started with a single image, one photo, one moment, one frame that people couldn't stop replaying. Cardi B, Stefon Diggs, Taylor Frankie Paul. 3 names, now locked in a story that's spiraling out of control. At first, it looked harmless, but the internet did what it always does, zoomed in, slowed it down, connected timelines, and then the questions started hitting like a storm. Was this planned? Was this hidden all along? And more importantly, who knew first? Because insiders are now claiming, allegedly, this wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't coincidence. This was something deeper, something that may have been unfolding quietly behind the scenes while everything looked perfect on the surface. And when that realization hit, that's when everything changed. Suddenly, the silence from Cardi wasn't just silence. It felt like pressure building. Every post, every move, every reaction started getting dissected. And then the word started spreading. She crashed out. Not just emotionally, but publicly. And if even half of these claims are true, then what we're looking at right now isn't just drama. It's the beginning of a full-blown collapse.
I don't gamble or place bets, but if there was any time to put a parlay in, it would be today, because I bet you the Patriots gonna win just off the strength of Stefon Diggs and Cardi B. We saw it last year with Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. I bet anything. I would be very shocked and surprised if the Seahawks win, but you know they be having a little script going on.
Yo, the moment that photo surfaced, something shifted. Not just online, but inside a story that had been carefully playing out behind closed doors. At first glance, it didn't look like chaos. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no public meltdown caught on camera. Just a quiet image, Stefon Diggs standing with Taylor Frankie Paul, and a timing that didn't sit right with anyone paying attention. Because timing is everything. Within minutes, the internet started doing what it does best, breaking things down frame by frame. Not just the photo, but the body language, the proximity, the expressions that seemed too familiar to be random. And then came the deeper question. Why now? Because this wasn't happening in isolation. This was happening after a relationship that already looked unstable from the outside. Cardi B and Diggs had built something that felt fast, intense, and highly visible. Every appearance, every public moment, it all fed into a narrative that looked solid on the surface. But behind that surface, cracks had already started forming. Not loudly, not dramatically, just subtle shifts, missed signals, colder interactions, a disconnect that most people didn't notice until it was too late. Then came the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that follows tension, the kind that builds pressure instead of releasing it. And right in the middle of that silence, this image drops. At first, fans tried to explain away coincidence, friendly interaction, industry overlap. But that explanation didn't last long, because as more eyes landed on it, the tone started changing. People weren't just looking at the photo anymore, they were looking at the timeline. And that's when things started getting uncomfortable. Allegedly, there were overlaps, moments that didn't line up cleanly, gaps in the story that suddenly felt intentional instead of accidental. And once that idea took hold, it spread fast. Forums lit up, comments sections flooded, every detail became evidence. Was this connection new, or had it been quietly developing long before anyone noticed? No confirmations, no clear statements, just speculation, and a growing sense that something wasn't being said.
Not gonna lie, man, this could be crazy. This could be something wild. So we know that Cardi B is pregnant by Stefon Diggs. They now have a baby on the way. But recently on social media, Stefon Diggs reposted something that was very interesting. So this woman named _pre on Instagram reposted him saying, "A piece of my heart. Stefon Diggs, thanks for always having my back no matter what."
Meanwhile, Cardi's presence started shifting. No direct response to immediate denial, just distance. And in situations like this, distance speaks louder than words. Because when someone who's usually vocal goes quiet, people don't assume peace. They assume impact. They assume something hit harder than expected. Then came the second wave, the reactions. Not official ones, not statements, but moments. Subtle changes in tone, energy that felt different, a presence that didn't carry the same confidence it once did. And that's when the narrative flipped. This wasn't just about Diggs being seen with someone new. This became about what that moment represented. A possible overlap, a possible betrayal, a possibility that everything was as clean as it looked. And once that door opened, it didn't close. Because now, every past moment started getting reevaluated. Every appearance, every interaction, every public display of connection. People weren't watching the present anymore. They were rewriting the past in real time. And in the center of all of it was a silence that kept getting louder. No confirmation, no closure. Just a growing storm of speculation and a story that was no longer under anyone's control. Because once the internet decides something feels off, it doesn't wait for proof. It builds its own version of the truth. And right now, that version is getting darker by the second. The longer the silence stretched, the louder the story became. What started as a single image was no longer just a moment frozen in time. It had evolved into a chain reaction. Every hour that passed without clarification only intensified the speculation. And this is where narratives begin to fracture. Because once people believe there's something hidden, they don't stop at what's visible. They start digging. Online, threads multiplied. Old clips resurfaced. Past interactions were pulled apart with surgical precision. The focus wasn't just on what had happened recently. It shifted to what might have been happening all along. And somewhere in that flood of analysis, a pattern began to form. Allegedly, nothing confirmed, nothing officially stated, but enough coincidences stacking up to make the situation feel heavier than coincidence alone. The timeline became the center of attention. When did things start going cold? When did appearances become less frequent? When did the energy between Cardi B and Stefon Diggs begin to shift? Because now, people weren't just asking what happened, they were asking when it really started. And that question changes everything. If the connection with Taylor Frankie Paul is recent, then this is a messy rebound. But if it isn't, then this becomes something else entirely. Something layered, something calculated, something that may have been unfolding quietly while the public was watching a completely different story. And that possibility is what turned curiosity into outrage. Because audiences don't just react to betrayal, they react to the idea of being misled. Meanwhile, the digital behavior started raising even more eyebrows. Accounts going quiet, content disappearing, a noticeable pullback from visibility. These aren't confirmations, but in the world of public figures, they rarely go unnoticed. Every move, or lack of movement, becomes part of the narrative. And right now, the narrative feels unstable. There's no clear direction, no controlled messaging, just fragments of a story being shaped by people on the outside looking in. But then came something even more telling, the shift in perception. At first, the focus was entirely on Diggs. Questions about loyalty, questions about timing, questions about whether something crossed a line. But slowly, attention started expanding. People began looking at Taylor's past, her controversies, her history of public drama. And suddenly, this wasn't just a relationship story anymore. It became a collision of reputations, two separate narratives merging into one situation and amplifying each other in the process. Because when controversy meets controversy, the impact doesn't double, it multiplies. Now, instead of one storyline, there are layers. A relationship that may have been breaking long before anyone realized, a possible connection that raises uncomfortable questions, and a public reaction that continues to evolve without any official explanation. And then there's Cardi, still present, but distant. Not reacting in a way people expected, not addressing anything directly, which only adds to the tension. Because in moments like this, silence doesn't calm things down, it fuels interpretation. People begin reading into everything. Tone, timing, absence, even the smallest detail starts carrying weight. And that's where things become unpredictable. Because once a story reaches this level, it stops belonging to the people involved. It becomes public property, shaped by opinions, driven by speculation, powered by emotion. And right now, all three are at their peak. No confirmations, no denials. Just a situation that keeps expanding with every passing moment. And the most unsettling part? We might only be seeing the surface. Because if even a fraction of these alleged connections hold truth, then what's coming next won't just clarify the story. It could completely redefine it. By the time the third wave hit, the story had already outgrown its origin. This was no longer about a single image, or even a possible connection that IT had transformed into something heavier, a narrative built on fragments, reactions, and the uncomfortable space between what's seen and what's suspected. Because once people start believing there's more beneath the surface, they stop waiting for answers. They start creating them. And that's exactly what happened here. The focus shifted again, not just on what Stefon Diggs did or who he was seen with, but on what this entire situation revealed about the relationship that came before it. The spotlight turned backward. Moments that once looked genuine were now being reinterpreted through a different lens. Appearances that felt natural started looking staged. Interactions that seemed effortless suddenly carried tension when replayed with new context. It wasn't just analysis anymore. It was reconstruction. Piece by piece, the audience began rebuilding a version of events that felt more aligned with what they were seeing now. And in that reconstruction, trust became the central theme. Because if the timeline doesn't align, if the energy doesn't match, if the ending feels too abrupt, then people assume something was hidden. Allegedly. That word became the backbone of every conversation. Not confirmation, but not dismissal either. a space where speculation thrives. And in that space, the narrative surrounding Cardi B started to shift in a different direction. At first, she was seen as distant, quiet, unresponsive. But then, the interpretation changed. That silence, it no longer looked passive. It started to feel controlled, intentional, like someone choosing not to speak, not because they have nothing to say, but because saying anything could escalate what's already spiraling. And that kind of restraint doesn't go unnoticed, especially in a situation where emotion is expected. Because when the audience anticipates a reaction and doesn't get one, they start asking a different question. What does she know that we don't? That question doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Suddenly, every small detail becomes a potential clue. A delayed post, a missing interaction, a shift in tone that would have gone unnoticed weeks ago. Everything starts carrying meaning. And while that's happening, the pressure builds on the other side. Diggs' position in this narrative becomes increasingly unstable. Not because of confirmed actions, but because of perception. And perception, in moments like this, moves faster than truth. The more people talk, the more defined the image becomes. A version of events begins to solidify, not through statements, but through repetition. And once a narrative repeats enough times, it starts to feel real. That's the danger. Because now, the story isn't being shaped by facts alone. It's being shaped by momentum. And momentum doesn't slow down easily. Meanwhile, Taylor Frankie Paul remains at the center of a different kind of attention. Not just because of this situation, but because of what she already represents in the public eye. Her past controversies don't stay separate from this moment. They merge into it, amplify it, turn a single question into multiple layers of doubt. Because when someone with a complicated public history enters an already unstable situation, the narrative doesn't stay simple. It becomes loaded. Now, people aren't just asking what happened between her and Diggs. They're asking, was this intentional? Was this opportunistic? Or was this just another chapter in a pattern that keeps repeating? No answers, just more angles, more speculation, more intensity. And right in the middle of all of it, the emotional weight of the situation continues to grow. Because beyond the theories, beyond the timelines, there's still a human element, a relationship that existed, a connection that people watched unfold in real time. And now, a collapse that's being analyzed just as publicly. That contrast between what was shown and what's being suggested is what makes this feel heavier than a typical breakup. It doesn't feel clean. It doesn't feel contained. It feels unresolved. And unresolved stories are the ones that last the longest because they leave space. Space for doubt, space for interpretation, space for the kind of questions that don't have immediate answers. And as long as that space exists, this story keeps evolving. New details could emerge, new perspectives could shift the narrative again, or everything could remain exactly as it is, unclear, unfinished, and open to interpretation. But one thing is certain, this isn't fading anytime soon, because stories like this don't disappear quietly. They linger, they expand, they resurface when you least expect them. And sometimes, the most impactful part isn't what gets revealed first, it's what comes out later. So now the situation stands where all unresolved narratives eventually land. Right at the edge of something bigger, waiting, not for closure, but for the next piece that changes everything. And just when it feels like the chaos has peaked, that's usually when the real truth starts slipping through the cracks. Because stories like this don't end with a photo, they escalate with what people haven't seen yet. Right now, everything is sitting in that dangerous gray zone. No confirmations, no denials, just a flood of reactions, speculation, and a timeline that refuses to make clean sense. And that's exactly where things get explosive. Because if even a fraction of these allegations hold weight, then this wasn't just a breakup. This was a slow collapse playing out behind the scenes while the public watched a completely different version of reality. And the scariest part, we still don't know who knew what and when. Was this a hidden connection that finally got exposed, or is this a narrative that spiraled out of control before anyone could contain it? Either way, the damage is already done. Reputations are shifting, perceptions are hardening, and once the audience locks into a version of the story, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. That's how viral scandals work. They don't wait for facts, they move on momentum. And right now, that momentum is ruthless. So the question isn't whether this story will fade, it's how much worse it's about to get. Because if another leak drops, if another detail surfaces, this entire situation could flip overnight in ways no one is prepared for. Stay locked in, because this isn't closure. This is just the part where everything gets darker.